The name on his identification papers read Charles Joseph Coward, and for a man with such an unfortunate surname, he would spend the next 5 years of his life proving that he was anything but. It was May 1940, and the beaches of Dunkirk were ablaze. The German war machine had smashed through Belgium and France with terrifying speed, and now the British Expeditionary Force was trapped, pinned against the cold waters of the English Channel, with nowhere to run. While hundreds of thousands of British soldiers desperately waiting for rescue boats that might never come, Sergeant Major Charles Coward found himself in an even worse situation. He wasn't at Dunkirk. He was at Calais, 26 miles down the coast, where the Germans had surrounded what remained of the British garrison. There would be no evacuation here, no flotilla of little boats sailing across the channel to save them, just capture, imprisonment, and an uncertain fate in the hands of the Nazi war machine. On the day Charles Coward became a prisoner of war, he made himself a promise. He would escape. And if he couldn't escape, he would make the Germans regret ever capturing him. What the Nazis didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that they had just captured the most dangerous prisoner of the entire war. A man who would escape from their camps 7 times. A man who would accidentally be awarded Germany's highest military honor. A man who would smuggle himself into Auschwitz itself and live to tell about it. A man who would save hundreds of Jewish prisoners from certain death. But first, he had to survive the march to his first prison camp. The escape artist. The German guards were exhausted. They had been fighting non-stop for weeks, pushing the British back mile by bloody mile, and now they were tasked with marching hundreds of captured British soldiers inland to prisoner-of-war camps. It was tedious work, boring work, the kind of duty that made men careless. Charles Coward noticed everything: the tired eyes of the guards, the way they clustered together to smoke and talk, leaving gaps in their surveillance, the moments when their attention drifted. He was 35 years old, older than most of the men around him, but his mind was sharp and his eyes were always calculating. They hadn't even reached the first prison camp when Coward made his first escape attempt. He simply walked away during a rest stop, melting into the French countryside like smoke. The guards didn't even notice he was gone until the next head count. They caught him within hours. France was now German territory, and a British soldier wandering alone stuck out like a lighthouse beam. But Coward had learned something valuable. The Germans were not infallible. They could be fooled. They could be beaten. He tried again 3 days later. This time he made it further before they dragged him back, angrier now, more suspicious. They beat him, threatened him, told him that the next time he tried to escape, they would shoot him. Coward smiled and began planning his third attempt. The Iron Cross Deception. By 1941, Charles Coward had become legendary among the prisoners. They called him the Count because of his aristocratic refusal to accept his captivity. He escaped from Stalag 8B in Poland, recaptured. Escaped again from a work detail in Germany, recaptured. Each time the Germans transferred him to increasingly harsh camps, hoping to break his spirit. It never worked. His 7th escape attempt would become the stuff of legend, a story so audacious, so impossibly bold, that even decades later people would struggle to believe it actually happened. Coward had been planning this escape for months. He had learned to speak German fluently by listening to the guards, memorizing their phrases, their accents, their casual conversations. When the opportunity came during a work detail, he slipped away and stole a German uniform from an unguarded supply depot. But the escape went wrong. Coward was injured, exactly how he would never fully explain, and found himself bleeding and disoriented in the German countryside. He needed medical attention, but going to a hospital meant certain capture. Unless. The audacity of what Charles Coward did next still defies belief. Instead of hiding his identity, he walked straight into a German military field hospital, still wearing the stolen uniform, and claimed to be a wounded Wehrmacht soldier. The German doctors never suspected a thing. Why would they? He spoke perfect German. He wore their uniform. He carried himself with confidence. They treated his wounds, gave him medication, and placed him in a recovery ward alongside genuinely wounded German soldiers. And then something extraordinary happened. A German officer walked through the ward one morning carrying a wooden box lined with velvet. Inside were iron crosses, Germany's highest military decoration for courage in combat. He was awarding them to wounded heroes, men who had distinguished themselves in battle against the enemies of the Reich. He stopped at Coward's bedside. The British sergeant major, lying in a hospital bed deep in Nazi Germany, surrounded by actual German soldiers, felt the cold metal of the Iron Cross being pinned to his chest. The officers saluted him, praised his bravery, wished him a speedy recovery so he could return to fighting for the fatherland. Charles Coward, prisoner of war, had just been decorated by the very enemy holding him captive. It couldn't last, of course. Someone eventually noticed inconsistencies in his story. Questions were asked. His identity was discovered. Within days, Coward found himself not just back in a POW camp, but being transferred to the harshest posting the Germans could imagine. They were sending him to Auschwitz. The Factory of Death. December 1943. Snow fell heavy over southern Poland as the train carrying Charles Coward and hundreds of other British prisoners pulled into the Auschwitz complex. But this wasn't the Auschwitz that would become infamous in history textbooks. This wasn't the gas chambers and crematoria of Birkenau. This was Auschwitz III, also known as Monowitz, a massive slave labor camp built around the IG Farben chemical plant. The company was manufacturing synthetic rubber and fuel for the German war machine, and they needed workers. Thousands upon thousands of workers. Most of those workers were Jews. The British prisoners were kept separate, housed in their own sub-camp about 5 miles from the main extermination facility at Birkenau. Under the Geneva Convention, British POWs couldn't be forced to work in war production, so they were given supervisory roles, administrative duties, light labor. Compared to the Jewish prisoners, they lived in relative comfort. But Charles Coward's fluency in German earned him a special position: Red Cross liaison officer for the British prisoners. It was a role that gave him unprecedented freedom to move throughout the camp, to travel into nearby towns, to interact with German officers without constant supervision. The Germans thought they were honoring him with responsibility. What they had actually done was give the most dangerous prisoner in their entire camp system complete access to their darkest secret.
Witnessing the unthinkable. Coward saw the trains arrive. Cattle cars packed so tightly that people could barely breathe, rolling through the gates of Birkenau day after day after day. He saw families torn apart on the selection platform, men to one side, women and children to the other. He saw the ones deemed too weak or too young or too old being loaded onto trucks and driven away. He saw the smoke rising from the chimneys, smelled the sweet, sickening smell that hung over the entire complex like a blanket, heard the whispered rumors from the Jewish work details about what was really happening just a few miles away. At night, lying in his bunk, Charles Coward understood that he was witnessing something beyond the normal horrors of war. This wasn't combat. This wasn't soldiers killing soldiers. This was systematic murder on an industrial scale. One day, a message reached him. Someone had smuggled out a desperate note. It was from a Jewish-British ship's doctor named Karel Sperber, being held somewhere in the Jewish section of Monowitz. The message was simple: help me. Coward made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Not because he regretted it, but because of what it forced him to see. He was going to smuggle himself into the Jewish section of the camp. One night in hell. The plan was insane. Jewish prisoners wore different uniforms, different identification, were subjected to completely different treatment. If Coward was discovered, there would be no explaining it away, no charming his way out with his German language skills. The SS didn't joke about prisoners crossing into restricted areas. But Coward had been planning and scheming for 3 years. He knew the guard rotations, the weak points in the fence, the moments of opportunity. During a work detail, he arranged to swap clothes with a Jewish prisoner. The man took Coward's British uniform and papers. Coward took the yellow star and the striped prisoner clothing. And then he walked into hell. The conditions were beyond anything Coward had imagined. The British section was harsh, but this was something else entirely. Men who looked like walking skeletons, their eyes hollow with despair and starvation. The constant presence of guards who beat prisoners for entertainment, for perceived infractions, for no reason at all. The smell of death and disease and human waste. The complete absence of hope in the faces around him. Coward spent an entire night in the Jewish section, searching desperately for Karel Sperber. He never found him. The camp was too vast, too chaotic, and asking questions would have exposed him immediately. But he saw enough, more than enough. When he smuggled himself back to the British section the next morning, Charles Coward was a changed man. He had walked through the heart of the Nazis' final solution and lived to tell about it. Now he had to do something about it. But what could one man possibly do against the machinery of genocide? Mr. William Orange. The letters Coward sent home seemed innocent enough. Updates about his health, mentions of other prisoners, casual observations about the camp. The German censors read every word and found nothing suspicious. What they didn't know was that Coward was writing in code. The man he was addressing his letters to, Mr. William Orange, didn't exist. It was a code name for the British War Office in London. Through these carefully crafted letters, Coward passed along military intelligence about the IG Farben plant, details about German troop movements, information about the treatment of prisoners, but most importantly, he sent descriptions of what he had seen at Birkenau. The trains arriving, the selections, the smoke, the mass murder of Jews happening just miles from where he was imprisoned. The information reached London. It was filed away, analyzed, compared with other intelligence reports. But it wasn't enough to save the people dying every day at Auschwitz. Britain was fighting for its own survival. They couldn't mount a military operation to liberate concentration camps deep in German-held territory. If anyone was going to save the Jews at Auschwitz, it would have to be Charles Coward himself. The chocolate trade. Red Cross packages arrived regularly at the British section of the camp. They contained food, cigarettes, chocolate, coffee, luxuries that were worth their weight in gold in a place like Auschwitz. The British prisoners were supposed to use these supplies for themselves. Coward had a better idea. He began bribing the SS guards, not with money, money was worthless here, with chocolate, with coffee, with cigarettes. Small luxuries that even the SS craved after years of brutal service in this place of death. And in exchange for these bribes, Coward asked for something specific: the identity papers and clothing of dead prisoners. Not Jewish prisoners, that wouldn't work. The papers had to be from Belgian or French civilian forced laborers, non-Jewish prisoners who had died from disease or accidents or brutal treatment. The guards, bribed and corrupted, delivered dead men's papers, dead men's clothes, dead men's identities, and Coward smuggled them into the Jewish section of the camp. The Great Exchange. The system Coward created was elegant in its simplicity and horrifying in its necessity. A Jewish prisoner marked for death would receive the papers and clothing of a dead non-Jewish prisoner. He would shed the yellow star, adopt a new identity, become someone else entirely. And then, using the network of contacts Coward had developed, Polish resistance members, bribed guards, sympathetic civilians in nearby towns, that prisoner would be smuggled out of the camp entirely. On paper, a non-Jewish forced laborer had died. The body count matched, the paperwork was in order. No one noticed that a Jewish prisoner had disappeared because technically, according to German record keeping, that Jewish prisoner was dead. The real dead body had been accounted for, everything balanced. It was impossible. It was dangerous. It was completely insane. It worked. Coward ran this operation for a year. He couldn't save everyone. The numbers arriving at Auschwitz were overwhelming, and he was just one man with limited resources. But he saved hundreds. The exact number will never be known. Some estimates say 400, others claim as many as 800. After the war, Coward himself couldn't say for certain because he deliberately kept no records. But hundreds of Jewish prisoners who should have died in the gas chambers of Birkenau walked out of Auschwitz with new identities. Because a British sergeant major with an unfortunate name decided that being a prisoner of war didn't mean he couldn't still fight the Nazis. The Death March. January 1945. Soviet artillery could be heard in the distance, growing closer every day. The Red Army was advancing into Poland, and everyone at Auschwitz knew what was coming. The Germans began destroying evidence, burning documents, dismantling the gas chambers, and they began to evacuate the camps. Coward and the other British POWs were forced to march west towards Germany in the dead of winter. Thousands of prisoners trudging through snow and ice, with guards shooting anyone who couldn't keep up. It was brutal, deadly, and chaotic, but it meant freedom was coming. The Allies were closing in from the west, the Soviets from the east. Germany was collapsing. Coward survived the death march. Allied forces liberated his column before they reached their destination. After 5 years as a prisoner of war, 5 years of escapes and schemes and desperate acts of heroism, Charles Joseph Coward was finally free. But his war wasn't quite over yet.
Nuremberg. The trials began in November 1945. Nazi war criminals standing in the dock, facing justice for crimes so vast that the human mind struggled to comprehend their scale. And among the witnesses called to testify was a British sergeant major who had spent over a year imprisoned at Auschwitz III. Charles Coward's testimony at the I.G. Farben trial was devastating. He described in detail the conditions at Monowitz, the slave labor, the systematic murder happening just miles away at Birkenau. He testified about the trains arriving, about the selections, about the smoke rising from the crematoria. He testified about what he had seen during his night in the Jewish section of the camp. His testimony helped convict several executives of I.G. Farben, the company that had built their chemical plant using slave labor from Auschwitz. It wasn't justice, not really. The sentences were light, and most of those convicted served only a few years. But it was something. It was acknowledgement that what happened at Auschwitz had been witnessed, documented, and condemned. Coward went home to England. He returned to civilian life, to his wife, to normalcy. He didn't talk much about what he had done, didn't seek recognition or glory. But the people he saved remembered. The Count of Auschwitz. In 1963, Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center in Jerusalem, named Charles Joseph Coward one of the righteous among the nations. It's an honor given to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. They planted a tree in his honor in the Avenue of the Righteous, a living monument to a man who refused to be a passive witness to genocide. They called him the Count of Auschwitz, partly because of his aristocratic demeanor, partly because other prisoners had nicknamed him the Count for his refusal to accept captivity, but mostly because he had done the impossible. He had fought the Nazis from inside their own prison camp system. He had smuggled himself into Auschwitz and walked back out. He had saved hundreds of lives that the Nazi machinery had marked for extermination. Charles Coward died in 1976, largely forgotten by the wider world. His story was too complex, too strange, too filled with elements that seemed impossible. There was even a movie made about him in 1962 called The Password is Courage, but it focused on his escapes and downplayed the Auschwitz rescue operation. For decades, some historians questioned whether his claims were exaggerated. How could one man have done all that? How could he have escaped 7 times? How could he have been accidentally awarded the Iron Cross? How could he have smuggled hundreds of people out of Auschwitz? But the testimonies exist. The Yad Vashem recognition is real. The trial transcripts from Nuremberg are in the archives. And somewhere out there, scattered across the world, are the descendants of Jewish prisoners who should have died in 1943 or 1944, but who instead walked out of Auschwitz with false papers and a new identity. They survived because a man named Coward refused to live up to his name. They survived because sometimes, in the darkest moments of human history, one person can make a difference. They survived because Charles Joseph Coward looked into the heart of evil and decided to fight back, not with weapons, not with armies, but with courage, cleverness, and an absolute refusal to accept that some people were beyond saving. He was a sergeant major, a prisoner of war, an escape artist, a spy, a smuggler, a hero. And despite his name, he was anything but a coward.